Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study today. We're going to be continuing in the book of Ezekiel, and today we're going to study chapter 38. Normally 38 and 39 are considered a unit. It's about this big war that we're going to be talking about. We can't get it all in a prescribed amount of time, so we're going to do chapter 38 this week and chapter 39 next time. Okay, in chapter 38 and 39 is about a war, about the war to end all wars, actually. It's not Armageddon, but it's the war at the end of the millennium. It's the end of the 1,000-year reign when there's a big war that we're going to talk about. That 1,000 years occurs in the kingdom on earth, in Jesus' kingdom on earth after the second coming, and we'll call that the millennium. When Jesus returns, we all think that there will be euphoria on earth. He will come, evil is vanquished, life is good. Well, that is basically true, except evil is not vanquished because Satan is not dead. If Satan is not dead, have we really vanquished evil? I want you to know these things because if you ever study Revelation, or when you study Revelation, that you won't be surprised when you read through these things. Okay. If we look at Revelation chapter 19, verse 19 through chapter 20, verse 3, we see Armageddon and the conclusion of Armageddon. In verses 2 and 3, Satan is captured and locked up for a very special reason, so that he cannot, let's see, what does it say? He cannot deceive the nations. So let's look at, I want to read Revelation chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, just so before we move on, I want you to know exactly what it says. It's key to our study today. Okay, chapter 20, in Revelation chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, says this: He sees the dragon was Satan, that ancient serpent. I want you to know for sure that we're talking about that ancient serpent from Eden, who is the devil, or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Then verse 3, so he's bound. This is in the millennium. Satan is captured and he is bound for 1,000 years. And verse 3 says he threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him here's the reason, to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. Okay, now that's key to our understanding. We talked about when Jesus comes again, the euphoria, the good times, the Eden-like conditions and all that, but evil is not vanquished. There's still going to be sin, but nevertheless, Jesus is Lord. He will reign as Lord of Lords, but Satan's going to be locked up for that entire 1,000-year period, and at the end, he's going to be released for a short period of time. Okay, during this time of 1,000 years, there's peace on earth as well as Eden-like conditions, and all of these various things that we've talked about in these prophecies in Ezekiel will be fulfilled. Then we're going to see Satan is released. Let's look at Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 through 10. This is background, and it's important for our understanding of this war that we're going to be talking about today. Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10. Listen to this. When the 1,000-year, okay, we just read how he's locked up for 1,000 years, but he's going to be set free for a short period of time at some time in the future. And that time is now, and right now what I'm going to read about. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. Okay, so he's going to be released and he's going to be set free to roam the earth, and he's going to be deceiving the nations, and he's going to convince them of things in his deception, and he's going to gather the nations for battle, and that battle is going to be against Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. They should know right then that they're being deceived if they think they can whip him. Nevertheless, in number, they are like the sand of the seashore, so it's a big army. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. So that's Jerusalem that we're talking about. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And in verse 10, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Okay. So this war that we're going to be talking about, in my opinion, the war that we're going to be talking about in Ezekiel 38 and 39, I believe, like I've already stated, it's this war that I just read about. It's going to occur when Satan is released, when he deceives the nations, convinces them to go to war, he gathers them for battle. That war that's going to be fought, I believe, is described in chapter 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. Okay. There's 7 oracles or prophecies in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that range from Gog and his allies coming against Israel to salvation and restoration for Israel, as foreseen in chapter 33 through 37 of Ezekiel, which we've already studied, which are the promises that we've already talked about. Okay, let's talk about principles of interpretation for just a second. The message is interpreted as literally as the context and the language allow. For example, in Revelation, there are some really strange descriptions. They do not look like they're to be interpreted literally, but when we actually get to that point in life, we may see that, hey, so that's what God meant when he said that. But for now, if we don't see it as a way something we should interpret literally, then we'll do it a different way. Another example is that when we study wars in the Bible, they didn't have tanks, they didn't have guided missiles, bombers, airplanes, and helicopters and all that stuff. They're always fighting their wars on horseback with arrows and bows and stuff like that. So this war that we're going to talk about today is no exception. So those were the modern implements of war at the time. Our modern implements of war are tanks, artillery, and helicopters, jet planes, and all that stuff. So if you have a problem reading this literally as horses, just think of it so that you can get through it. Just think of it as modern implements of war. You know, when they gather for war, they're gathering their tanks, they're gathering their airplanes, and that sort of thing. So since we believe the Bible, the biblical writers are called and inspired by God, these chapters are assumed to harmonize, or rather to edify and to build on and add to prophecies earlier times in the Bible. So God will give us a prophecy. You know, if you're trying to say, well, this doesn't agree with that one, or this has more information than that one, and that sort of thing, God doesn't give you the whole picture at one time. He edifies. The Bible interprets the Bible. As we find another prophecy, It may be talking about the same event we've already talked about once before, but it gives more detail, and it gives that detail for deeper understanding and edification. Divine revelation is believed to have unfolded gradually so that later prophecies expand on and explain further the prophecies that can come before. All right. So, for example, we read the war to end all wars there in Revelation. It's not Armageddon. It's the war at the end of, that I'm talking about, is the end of the 1,000-year reign. We have this information in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that enhance and edify the part that's in Revelation 20. We also get information from Revelation 20 that says that Satan was released and he had a big part in that war in 38. He's not even mentioned there. So that's the reason the Bible is written like it is. It's for our understanding. God's not trying to hide stuff from us. He wants us to understand. So he does things certain ways. All right. The war that we're talking about today in Ezekiel 38 has been thought of in 7 different ways. You know, what could that war actually be? I'm going to tell you what they are real quickly, then we're going to get right on into it. The first one is it's entirely symbolic. Well, I already know what to say about that, so I'm going to go to the second one. The second will be a battle. The battle will occur before the tribulation, just before or just after the rapture of the church. It's pretty interesting. Somebody could believe that because they don't know when the rapture is. The third way to look at this, that some people have looked at it, it's in the middle of the tribulation. So we have this 7-year period, and it occurs right in the middle of that 7-year period. And that comes from ideas that are talked about in Revelation 14, verses 14 through 20, and Daniel 11, verses 40 through 41, 40 and 41. So look at that if you want to, whenever you get around to it. The fourth way is the battle occurs at the end of the tribulation, which means it would be Armageddon. That's the fourth way to look at this. Sorry about that. So the fourth way is to consider it as as Armageddon. And that would be the same war that's talked about in Revelation 19, verses 11 through 21. If you want to write that down, 19, 11 through 21, you can go back and read that. The fifth way is to consider it as occurring between the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennium. Well, again, that's right on the cusp there when Armageddon occurs. So that would be Armageddon, basically. The sixth way, and this is the way that I view it, and that's the end of the millennium, as described there in chapter 20, verses 7 through 8. That's a major war that's going to occur. It's where evil is actually vanquished, and it's going away and never coming back. So it's a very important war, and yet this is the only place that I can find that it's mentioned, is Ezekiel 38 and 39. Okay, and the seventh way is a combination of number 4 and number 6. Number 4 was that it's Armageddon. Number 6 is the way I believe, and that's the end of the millennium. So the way that view would shake out is that there's a big pause between the two, and it's a pretty big pause. It's 1,000 years long. So, but that way basically boils down to being the war that ends it comes about at the end of the millennium. So nevertheless, as I said, number 6, the end of the millennium is the way I view this. I have notes all over the place in commentaries in my Bible to that effect. But for now, in Ezekiel, I will teach it based on my assumption that, in my understanding and my belief, that in the sixth way of looking at this, that this is the way it is, and that would be occurring at the end of the millennium. Okay, I have some pretty compelling thoughts on some of that too, and I don't see how you can get around just chunking it out and not considering it. So we'll see it when we get to it. Okay, so we're into Ezekiel 38, verses 1 through 9. This is Gog, G-O-G. This is Gog's call to arms. We're going to talk about that, talk about who he is right now. So let me read verses 1 through 3. The word of the Lord came to me. Again, this is God's word. This is not Ezekiel's word. Ezekiel's just recording what he's told by God. Okay. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog, G-O-G, of the land of Magog, the chief priest of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog, chief priest of Meshech and Tubal. Okay, so as we study chapters 38 and 39, we hope to answer these questions. The first one is, who is Gog? The second would be, what battle is described? So we hope to get enough information out of this to figure out which of those 7 ways of looking at that this is. Where does it take place? You see it's in a valley, and what valley is it? Where does it I can't read my writing there. Where does it take place? First one was, when does it take place? The next one is, where does it take place? And then, why does it take place? Now that I've said that, we want to answer those questions. Most likely, we're not going to answer any of them because there's not enough information here to actually know for certain that my way of interpreting it, this is correct. But that would also be true if you had any one of the other 6 beliefs. Okay, but you'll see that it won't matter as we go through here. It would be nice to know, but nevertheless. So there in verses 1 through 3, God says he's going to set his face against Gog. He says, of Magog. And he says Gog is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So Gog is a man. Well, let me just keep going. It's much more stuff there's much more stuff to come, but here God says basically he is against Gog, the man Gog, the man named Gog. It says he's a man. He says he's the chief priest of these countries, so that's a man. It's nothing else but a man. All the other stuff modifies and edifies who it is that we're talking about. So who is Gog? He just shows up here. That's what's interesting. Just out of nowhere, we get to 38, and he shows up. The Bible starts talking about Gog. Most of the time, you have a guy that shows up in the Bible for some reason, and you get some kind of background information on him, so you know who he is and what he's all about. But Gog only appears 3 times in the Bible. Let me tell you where they are. The first one is in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 4. Gog is identified there with one of the sons named Reuben, one of Jacob's sons named Reuben. Commentaries are not the commentaries don't say much about it, but it states that some repercussion from Reuben is there from defiling his father's marriage bed. So there's some kind of interference there that you probably wouldn't want your son having with your wife. It's interesting to me that that the land promised to Reuben is Ammon. If you recall, there were three countries that were going to be spared the hand of the Antichrist. They were Moab, Edom, and Ammon. Ammon is one of those three countries that's going to be spared the hand of the Antichrist for some reason. Okay, so that's the first occurrence of Gog. The second occurrence of Gog is right here in what we're going to be talking about in chapter 38. The third mention of Gog is in Revelation 20, verse 8, which I find interesting, which is one of the verses that we just read. And I believe it's a reference to here in chapter 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. Chapter 20, verse 8 of Revelation said, Satan will be released. Let me read 7 and 8. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand of the seashore, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's pretty compelling if we're talking about Gog that's right here. Wouldn't have to be, but nevertheless, if it is, it just strengthens my feeling that the war occurs at the end of the millennium. Okay, Magog is the third way is that Magog is referred to in the table of nations in Genesis 10, verse 2. I don't know if you've ever studied that before, but it's after the flood. After the flood, there were no nations, so they got to get them organized again, and God defines how they're going to develop from that table that's there in Genesis 10, verse 2. This table looks like a genealogy, and it is, but that is not the purpose. The purpose is to show that nations formed from the descendants of these people in the table. So you're going to get a list of names that are from the sons of Noah, and how their family trees developed through time and the nations that came from them. There were no nations following the flood, and this describes the formation of the nations, and Gog is in there. So now back to Gog. Gog, is called the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. These are provinces which today are part of Iran, Turkey, and southern Russia. Many people today believe Gog is the leader of Russia, and Magog is Russia and the countries to the north of Israel. So we're not really concerned with that, but that's one of the beliefs that people have from word constructions and geography that's going to be mentioned in here and that sort of thing. One interesting interpretation is that Gog represents Babel or Babylon. If you're back in, talking about Nimrod, who is one of the guys listed in that family tree back in the Table of Nations, he developed the city or the country, the area called Babylon, and they were the ones that actually started constructing the Tower of Babel. Babylon, and one other thing I'd like to mention is that the interesting thing in Ezekiel 25 to 32 is that Babylon was the only nation not mentioned by Ezekiel, and with a specific judgment. And I said that at the time when we studied that, the possibility was that he couldn't talk about it. Remember where Ezekiel was? The entire time he wrote this book, it starts out telling us where it was. He said he was on the banks of the Kibar River, and he was with the captives. So he was already a captive. He wrote this entire book under revelation of the Holy Spirit, inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He wasn't there for all this stuff to happen. He said, this is just the way it is. And because he was there, He's got guards all around him all the time. He has to be careful what he says. And many people think that he didn't mention Babylon specifically because guess what? That's the country that's holding him captive. Okay, Ezekiel never talked about the destruction of Babylon in general or in specific defeat or the specific defeat by the Medo-Persian invasion in the night. And why would he mention that? The answer may be that Gog is used as a symbol for Babylon in chapter 38 and 39. So if he wanted to sneak it in there some way, he might just use a code to get it done. I don't know. Babylon would represent the nations of the world aligned against God in the end times. Here, Ezekiel is not concerned with the Babylon of 600 BC, which was the Babylon of his day, but the ultimate destruction of the mystery Babylon, which is mentioned in Revelation in the last days. That's in Revelation 17:5. If you want to go look at it, you'll see that it's talking about the woman riding the beast and that sort of thing, but it's called Mystery Babylon. For the total restoration of Israel to take place, Babylon would have to be overthrown because they're under captivity under Babylon. So for everything else to happen, Babylon has to be out of the picture. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is the perfect place for this to happen. The forces of Babylon would represent the coalition forces of Magog, Meshach, Tubal, and some of the others that are listed there. It would be the coalition forces of the Antichrist going into Armageddon. For this commentator in the New American Commentary, he believes Gog and Magog, Mystery Babylon of Revelation, are one and the same. So he believes that Gog is the code name for Babylon, and there is a 1,000-year pause between Armageddon and the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Then it starts up again. So he believed that the war spoken of here in 38 and 39 would occur at the end of the Millennium, but it's a continuation of the war that was started 1,000 years earlier at Armageddon. But we know that Jesus squashed that war just out of hand at Armageddon, and we've got a pause here that even like conditions, then it cranks up again according to him. But that's different than the way I'm going to teach you today, but it's practically the same way. This means under the commentator's view, Gog is killed. So how does it restart in 1,000 years? It would have to be a title, not a name. So Gog would have to be a title and not a name. Okay, so this is the war. My belief is that this is a new war with Gog reforming. Right. It makes much more sense to me for this to be a new conflict or war. Many think Gog is symbolic of a country in command of coalition forces representing the ultimate evil against Israel. Many think Gog is a man in command of coalition forces still representing the ultimate evil against Israel, and he might be. Truth be known, these could actually be one and the same. For example, we think of the United States being in command of coalition forces, but the actual commander is a man. It's the President of the United States. And we talk about that as who's in charge as being one and the same. So that would apply could apply in a similar way to Gog and Magog. You have a man in charge, but you also have a country in charge. So that could be how this is coming down. To me, I like Gog being a man, since that's what it says. The Bible says he is the prince of Meshech and Tubal. So Gog is a man. He would command the allies of Magog, who are Meshech and Tubal, but probably also Gomer and Togarmah, which is mentioned in chapter 38, verse 6, which we're going to run up on here in just a second. Okay, about Gog. Some have thought Gog came from the Goths of the 4th century, or the Arab armies of the 7th century, or the Mongol hordes of the 13th century, or the Roman Empire, the Pope, the Turks, and so on and so forth. It goes on and on like that. They think it could be Gomer from Germany in World War I. Today, Red China, a king of the East, is in Revelation 16:12. So here's the thing. We have a world with much tribulation, so there's always flexibility in choosing who the Gog of our time is. Okay. Some think that Rosh, one of the names mentioned here, is Russia. If you look on the map, Moscow is directly north of Jerusalem, with some other stuff up there in the north as well. Okay, these choices for Gog, Magog, kings of the east, always seem to be chosen without regard for the other parts of the prophecy. So again, I said prophecies are not fulfilled until they're fulfilled. It can look like it's developing in one direction as to be the fulfillment of the prophecy, then it'll make an abrupt turn somewhere down the road and says, well, it can't be that anymore. It has to be something else. It may be that Russia is Gog and will be in command of coalition forces. It may be that China is a representation of the kings of the east. It may be, until the whole prophecy and all prophecies are fulfilled, we will not know. So that's what we're talking about. We don't know who Gog is. We can only surmise how things look right now. We can obviously look back at all the things that people used to think and just throw them out because they haven't worked out. It's been a change and they're looking at it from a different way now. Okay, so let's look at verses 4 through 9. This is the announcement of the invasion. Let me read verses 4 through 6, chapter 38. I will turn you around. God says this. I will turn you around, Gog. God is I and Gog is you. Okay? I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out of with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. So it sounds like a pretty formidable army. God has total control of it. He's just going to put the proverbial hook in your jaw, just like you put it in a fish. You got control of it. He's going to turn you around, he says. All right. Here is the coalition against Israel. We get an announcement of the coming battle with God being in control of it. He will use hooks to drag them into battle. God wants them to go into battle. It's part of the plan. This is much like he used Babylon to exact discipline on Judah. He used an ungodly nation to discipline Judah. He's got a similar situation here. He's chosen an ungodly nation in a very godly time, I might add. This is the millennium when Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And God is saying it's time to squelch evil. And so what he's done, he's got Gog all lined up to be the one to try to do it. And it's not going to work out for him. So he uses this coalition that will be a great, big, well-equipped army. It's a mounted cavalry. Well-armed, big and small helmets and shields, and many soldiers. Probably much larger that we're going to see than Israel, the army of Israel. Okay, verses 7 through 9, we're getting into the position of the prophecy, and we're getting into the portion of the prophecy that clearly indicates end time, not near future to them, but the future to them as yet unfulfilled even to us. So they got this vision. Ezekiel got this vision back in, just call it 600 BC, and they're all thinking it's going to be right around the corner. It's future to them, and it's still even future to us. It has not occurred yet. So let me read verse 7. Get ready. Be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you, and take command of them. He's talking to Gog. Get ready, be prepared, get command of your forces. Gog takes command of the forces that I send. Says, God, this means that God had to choose Gog. Verse 8, after many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people are gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. Very key statements here. After many days, which means in future years, sometime in the future. This is a typical eschatological term, like the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord meant a day for God to experience victory over somebody at sometime in the future and in the latter days. These terms are nowhere else mentioned in Ezekiel except right here. And they clearly made this passage as a reference to eschatological end time events. So it's not around the corner for them. It's clearly in the future. As it turns out, it's clearly in our future as well. Furthermore, it says they have recovered from war. It says that you will invade a land that has recovered from war. Well, it's pretty much true of Israel. They were in war with the Babylon of 600 BC. They will have been regathered to the land, it says. This is going on now, but not like it said in Jeremiah. This is very important. Let's look at that right now because we made this discovery last week. That's Jeremiah 29 verses 13 and 14. It said here that they had been regathered. It says those people who were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel. So it says that for the sake of this prophecy, for this prophecy to be fulfilled, it says that has to have happened. Now, we're looking at Israel today, and Jews from all over the world are moving back there. It seems like they're being dragged back there. But I want to tell you that Jeremiah was pretty clear on how God is going to do that regathering. I want to go to Jeremiah 29, verses 13 and 14. 13. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. So the Jews have to be looking for God, for him to be able to find them. You know, we talked about them being scattered to every nation of the world. We read that. They're scattered all over the place. They've got bloodlines that have been modified and corrupted. They're no longer full-blood Jew, no longer full-blood Israelite. How does God determine who is Jewish or not? What he says here, he said, you will call on me. I'm sorry, 13. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. So you got to be looking for him. He said, I will be found by you. It's that act of searching for God. When he says, you will find me if you seek me. And he says, I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. So those that find him are the ones he's going to regather. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. That's how he's going to figure out where they are. They're the ones that are going to be seeking him. And once they seek him, they will find him. Then he says, I will be found by you, and I'm going to regather you. So it's going to be a supernatural regathering. The next point there, it says, here's the big one for me. It says they are dwelling in the land securely. So the people that are going to be assaulted by Gog are dwelling in the land in Israel securely, safely. Israel has never lived in safety, ever. Even today, with their Iron Dome missile defense system, they're not living securely. Every day they live, they're living in existential existence because of all the missiles that come flying in there. They miss one, they can have some pretty severe damage. So you can't possibly consider them living in safety today. And even in the times of the Antichrist, they're going to be having big problems. They're going to make a deal, a 7-year peace treaty with the Antichrist, and that's going to give them some security in their minds, but they're going to find out that's not secure at all. They're not living in safety there at all. In fact, this big genocide is going to be going on that Jesus talked about at the end of that, in the middle of that 7-year period. So Gog is going to attack a land of people that is living in securely. So that's not now. So Gog and his coalition will advance on Israel. Verse 9 says this, you and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. So particularly, the size of his army relative to the size of the army of Israel is no comparison. And I'm not even sure that Israel has an army at this point. You have to remember, they've been living for 1,000 years in the shadow of the Almighty. The King of Kings is going to be their protector. War, danger, anything related to danger is furthest thing from their mind. They've had 1,000 years of euphoria and Eden-like conditions living under the hand of Christ. So yeah, they're living in safety for sure during the millennium. Okay, let's look at verse 10. We're getting down to Gog's evil scheme now. Verse 10 says this. Before I read, let me just say this. This verse, to me, is indicated that this is the war at the end of the millennium. Before that war, Satan was, we've already read this, we've talked about it, I want to talk about it again. Before that war, in Revelation 20, verses 7 and 8, Satan was released from the abyss. He will go out, he will deceive the nations. That's what it says in verses 7 and 8 of Revelation. He's released, and that's what he's going to do. That's what Satan does. is he deceives. He's the deceiver. So if he's loose to roam the earth and get out among the nations, that's what he's going to be doing, deceiving them. Now I want you to go to Job 1. Or you can just listen as I read. Job 1. If you want to know how Satan works, we go to Job 1, verse 7. I want you to look at what Satan is doing. The Lord said to Satan, "Where had you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant?" Well, that goes on to why Job was written. But that was what we're told that Satan was doing. He was roaming the earth. Now he's been released at the end of the 1,000 years. Satan is released. And what does it say he's doing? He's going to roam the earth. He goes out, and he goes out in his roaming. He goes out to deceive the nations. And who does he find? He finds Gog. Let's look at verse 10. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. Thoughts will come into your mind. In other words, he will notice. He will say, I never noticed that before. And he will devise an evil scheme. We're about to look at what that scheme is now. And it's a plan for the invasion. Clearly, this is man is dwelling in darkness. And if you've ever been in my class for very long, you can't get away from hearing me say that dwelling in darkness means that you hate God, you hate the things of God, His Word, His people, His church. You like it the way it is in the darkness, and you even prefer it that way, and the way it is in the darkness. That's Gog. He is a man of pure evil. He's the kind of guy that if he drove up to your house in his car, and your son's toy truck was sitting in the driveway, he would go out of his way to run over it. He was just an evil man. That's who we're talking about when we're talking about Gog. All right, so he just all of a sudden has this idea. That's what it said. He said, in verse 10, it says, on that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. It's just going to show up in your mind. So let's read 11 and 12. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. Very interesting. He just has an aha moment. And here's what he notices. He just notices it. Just comes out of nowhere. This has been going on for 1,000 years, and you're telling me that all of a sudden he just notices after 1,000 years? Satan has been released, and he put this in his mind. He shows him the plan: attack a peaceful, unsuspecting people. They lived in 1,000 years under the hand of Jesus Christ. Why in the world would they suspect something like this is going to happen? They're living without walls and gates. They don't need them. The walls and gates were for protection. They didn't need any protection. Gog is going to plunder their land. That's part of the plan. He said he's going to plunder and loot against a rebuilt town and a regathered people. The Jews are going to be regathered, and they're going to be in Jerusalem that has been rebuilt. You know, we're talking about Jerusalem being war-torn, you know, with what was going on in the tribulation. It was totally torn down. It's going to be rebuilt. They're going to be regathered. They're going to be living in the center of the land. They're going to be living in the center of the land. That's the same word. If you look in just about every translation except the NIV, it says, some of them say earth, center of the earth, and some of them say center of the world. But nevertheless, it's probably not the geographic center, though it could be. Probably depends on how you look at it. But it's the civil and religious center of theological center of the earth, and that would be Jerusalem. The world, the word for land, I think is Eris or something like that, is actually the same word used for earth in other parts of the Bible. This is the center of God's favor, Jerusalem. That's right exactly where they're going to be living, right in the center of the earth. Okay, verse 13 says this. Sheba, so that's what I want you to remember. This is very important to remember this as we go forward. There's been 1,000 years of peace and euphoria. Sin is still alive there. I want you to think back. I didn't say this today. I should have said this earlier. When the Armageddon occurs, Messiah comes and squashes it, wipes out the armies, just decimates the armies of the nations. But their families, their wives, their mothers, their mother-in-laws, their children, their nieces, their brothers, all of those people are still left at home. They are all unsaved people. They are still alive and they're still in existence. They weren't killed at Armageddon. They're still going to be alive when Jesus reigns. So sin is not dead during the millennium. All right, verse 13. So that was the thought. He just noticed this of people that are unprotected. I think I'll go get them. So verse 13 says that Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all our villages will say to you, have you come to plunder? Have you gathered your hoards to loot, to carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, and to seize much plunder? That's the question. Are you going to do that, God? And that's what everybody wants. I want in on it. That's what that's all about. Verse 14 to 16 is about Gog's advance on Israel. It's sort of a restatement of what we've already seen. Let's look at verse 14. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the Sovereign Lord says, in that day, when my people Israel are living in safety, again, in safety, will you not take notice of it? You're just going to accidentally, just out of nowhere, think about it and notice that they're living in safety and unprotected. You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. In verse 16, you will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. Verse 14, but God will get his command to go forward. Again, Satan has been released. I think I just went through that, but I can't say this enough. Satan has been released. He's been released to roam the earth and deceive the nations, and he found Gog. And Gog takes notice. Just on his own? No, I don't think so. I think he was prompted by Satan. From where will his place in the far north, from which he will take notice? Moscow is almost directly north of Israel. I'm not saying that's where it comes from, but it's one of the thoughts that's going around these days. Moscow is directly north. It does not have to be north to be far north, but there's not much else up there. That's what my notes say. Some other countries might take exception to that. But in verse 16, God will bring them against his land. God is going to do it. I'm going to bring you against my land, he says, so that the nations will know who I am. Okay, verse 17 through 23 is God's wrath against Gog. Verse 17, let's read that. This is what the Sovereign Lord says. You are the one I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel. At that time they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. a very important verse to understand. We have been reading about, up to this point, we've been reading about judgment of Judah. This is not that. This is judgment of Gog. Prophets from former days are looking back, not forward. Here he's looking back at prophets from former days. So he's not looking and talking about those prophets. They're back there, not up here. He's not indicating he is the one. He is asking if he is the one. It's a question. Are you not the one I spoke of? A lot of discussion is that the prophecies is about the prophecies he is talking about, and none of that is clear to us. I think the experts have a problem figuring out what he's talking about. Nevertheless, to me, the crux of the question is what is important. Are you not he that I will bring against Israel? He's expecting a no response. No, I am not the one. The real meaning is this: he is divinely commissioned, but not in bringing judgment against Israel. Israel is not being judged. Gog is. This judgment we're talking about going forth right here in chapter 38 is judgment of Gog. Israel has already been restored. They're living in restoration in the millennium. The judgment, there will be no further judgment against them. It's going to be judgment against the ones that come against them, and that's Gog and his armies. Okay, verses 18 to 20. Let's read those. This is what will happen in that day. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord, in my zeal and fiery wrath. And these are tough words to think about. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the beasts in the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. It's a global thing. The earthquake occurs there, but it's going to, like the whole world knows it. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall will fall to the ground. So this is a pretty good-sized earthquake. All right. When Gog attacks in that day, it says, God's hot anger will be aroused. Hot anger, not just common everyday anger. This is his hot anger. It's kind of you don't want to be around. In my zeal and fiery wrath, that's another thing. Wrath is one thing. Fiery wrath has got to be something different. I will send a great earthquake, a big one, maybe even the big one, the biggest one. Here the thing is to keep in mind, when acts of God are, I want you to consider this. You read an insurance policy, they talk about exclusions being acts of God. Even when they don't even believe in God, they still use the term. When acts of God are displayed in nature, generally people call them acts of nature, with no recognition given to the judgment of God. What I'm saying here is that it is not a matter of what you think, because it'll be all over now. This is your last chance. All right, look at the devastation. The beasts, the birds, and creatures and people will tremble. You know, when we read Revelation, I don't know why this sticks in my mind, but of all the judgments, this is one that just really stuck in my mind. I didn't look up the reference for it, but maybe you'll remember it on your own. There was a judgment going on, and there was a lot of devastation on the earth, and people were hiding in caves to keep the rocks from falling on them. And they knew, the Bible right there when it's talking about, is very clear that they knew who sent that judgment. They knew it was the God in heaven. And still they wouldn't repent. I remember that. This is kind of the same thing. They will recognize the earthquake as the presence and tremble in it, as God's presence, and they will tremble in it. Mountains overturn, great landslides, cliffs crumble, walls collapse. This is a serious situation, and I don't see any mention of repentance anywhere. 21 and 22, we just talked about the earthquake and all that devastation that we saw. Forgive me for that. Verses 21 and 22 say this in chapter 38. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him. They will fight each other. There's going to be general confusion. We have heard this from Zechariah, Daniel, and other places. This comes in the forms of God's judgment on Gog and the coalition forces. And in the last part of 22 says, now he uses the real methods of devastation, stuff they can't fight against, rain and hail, burning sulfur. How do you like burning sulfur falling from the sky? More manifestation of God's judgment on Gog and the nations with him. And verse 23 says this, and so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Oh, wow. Oh, I will show my greatness and my holiness. The nations will see who God is. Then they will know who God is. His holiness is paramount. He does this to show that he is holy. We know he's great, and really, unless you're living in denial, the rest of the secular world would have to know that he's great. They want to claim that he's great. They want to claim that they know him, but that's not necessarily true. His holiness is what's paramount, and they will see who God is, and they will know who God is. They will know who God is. It says, they will know that I am the Lord. They will know because things are done in such a way that they will know that it was God that did it. I would love one more comment on this issue of holiness, but they will see God for who he is, and they will know God for who he is. They cannot help but know that because he is holy, he is worthy of worship. Oh. All right, that's all I have for you today. We're going to talk next week about chapter 39. There'll be a tiny little bit of review because those scriptures that come out of Revelation about Satan's capture and binding and his release and how he roams the world to deceive the nations, those are paramount to the study of chapter 38. I don't hear anybody making a big deal out of that except me, but I want you to consider it. Think about Job. What they said about Job. Job, God asked him, where were you, Satan? He said, I was out roaming the nations. I was roaming around. He wasn't looking for a vacation spot. He was out there to deceive the world, roaming around. He's released after 1,000 years of captivity, 1,000 years of total peace and prosperity and Eden-like conditions, a time of total safety, a time of living with no protection, no walls, no villages, not needing protections because Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, is in charge. Then they release Satan, and he goes out to roam the nations to deceive the world, and he finds Gog. All right, that's all I have for you. So we'll talk about chapter 39 next week, and it's kind of like the clean up after the aftermath here. So we'll talk about that next week. Thank you very much for studying with me.